Cool. So, what are we going to be talking about today? So, we're going to be talking about healthcare and security. Two things that sound quite scary when said in the same sentence, but a really important topic. Attacks on the healthcare industry are on the rise. And I feel like historically, people kind of shied away from talking about it. Nobody really wanted to talk about vulnerabilities in healthcare systems, but that is changing. And there are probably going to be parts of this talk that you might find seem a little bit lighthearted, but I want you to kind of see this as a call to arms. What can we do as an industry to help the healthcare industry become more secure and prevent some of the attacks that we're seeing? Okay, so just a little bit about me to begin with. So my name's Katie Innes. I currently head up the attack surface management team at WizSecure. I think I'm number 3 of XMWR here, so that's, quite cool. What has this got to do with healthcare, I hear you say? Well, not much on the surface of things, but, I'm going to be sprinkling a little bit of ASM throughout this talk, so definitely look out for that. And healthcare has definitely been a side project of mine for the last couple of years. Okay, so I originally presented this research at DEF CON last year, but you guys are very lucky in the sense that this is a special extended edition. So I've added in a few extra bits of research here and there, but the main basis will be around a protocol named Health Level 7. I'll start by going through the lay of the land with regards to attacks on healthcare. We'll talk about a few different examples, one of which is medical devices. I'll talk through a few different protocols that are used to communicate patient data and different types of medical data. We'll talk about Health Level 7 in a little bit more detail, various vulnerabilities and their impacts. Then I'll go into the various challenges that come with testing HL7. And that's where I'll go through a tool that I've developed to help testing this protocol and make it a lot easier. So that's where I'll show you my demo, and we'll do a few wrap-ups with regards to key takeaways. So first, let's talk about attacks against the healthcare industry. So Checkpoint put out a really good piece of research last year, and they actually observed around 1,684 attacks against the healthcare industry in just the first 3 months of 2023 alone. So this really highlights the fact that the healthcare industry is becoming one of the most targeted industries, and it's definitely up there in comparison to the likes of the financial industry. This data is taken from the HIPAA journal. HIPAA obviously focus a lot on the US side of things, but they have got quite a lot of global data available to them as well. And this really highlights that upward trend year on year. But why are we seeing an increase? Why are we seeing this upward trend? Well, I think it's safe to say that in the more early years, healthcare attacks just weren't really being reported. There wasn't a need to report them. And then I guess on the other hand, maybe they weren't even being detected in the first place. If we look at the more recent years, I feel like there's been a bit of a shift in motive. So historically, ransomware groups decided that they were just going to soar off targeting the healthcare industry. But we're definitely seeing a change in more recent years. But why? Why are we seeing this change? So we know that personal healthcare information is considered to be one of the most sensitive types of data, and because of this, it's sold for a lot of money on the dark web. This, in combination with the healthcare industry being incredibly underfunded with regards to security, makes for a really easy target for a ransomware group's perspective. Okay, so these are some of the top threats to healthcare in 2024. No surprises here. These are probably some of the common threats that you probably see across other industries as well. And I guess the more specific one to healthcare is probably IoT, and that's one of the ones that we're going to look into in just a sec. But firstly, we're going to look into data breaches. So data breaches are often the consequence of another attack. So ransomware attack has occurred, access to data, data sold on the dark web, and therefore data breach has occurred. But we're actually going to be looking at data breaches as a whole for this part of the talk. So firstly, data breaches are very expensive. IBM put out a really good report recently called The Cost of a Data Breach, and they've got a really nice section in there about healthcare, and they actually state that with regards to the healthcare industry, it cost them around 9.77 million as a result of a data breach. And this is actually 11% lower than it was in 2023. So that's, yeah, quite significant. In terms of initial access vectors, again, nothing sort of new, nothing specific to healthcare here, but one of the more common types of initial access vector is phishing. But other initial access vectors are things like malware and exploiting software vulnerabilities. But the one that is a little bit more specific to healthcare is the fact that it takes around 213 days to identify a data breach. And that's actually 19 days slower than the average across other industries. Okay, so the online mental health platform Cerebral, they actually suffered a data breach in 2023. This actually impacted around 3.1 million patients. This occurred through the implementation of tracking pixels to their website. And this was basically sending data off to a number of big tech companies like Meta and TikTok. But they did not have consent from the patients. So little did the patients know, their personal information and also mental health assessment data was being sent off to these companies. So this is quite an interesting case because it's not necessarily considered malicious, but in terms of being a data breach, data was leaked and therefore has an impact in terms of the patients that were affected. Okay, on to ransomware. So here's a fun fact for you. The first known ransomware attack occurred all the way back in 1989 and consequently targeted the healthcare industry. When we think about ransomware, I'm sure your mind is cast all the way back to the glorious year of 2017, where WannaCry graced our presence. Of course, this had a massive impact on the NHS, and around 200,000 systems were impacted globally. If we look at 2023, there were around 630 ransomware incidents observed globally. And again, similar to data breaches, initial access through things like phishing, exploiting software vulnerabilities, and things like targeting exposed services like RDP. This is how things are kind of looking for 2024. So this is actually data taken from our own ransomware collection through different incidents that we've been dealing with. And as you can see, started off relatively low, but we've kind of leveled out now through the middle of the year and probably predicted to rise towards the end of 2024 as well. Okay, so Change Healthcare, you may remember this one from the beginning of this year, but Change Healthcare are actually a company that deal with payments between patients and healthcare providers. So, for example, where a doctor might need to bill a patient for services, they might use a company called like Change Healthcare to deal with all the payments and admin side of things. So they suffered a ransomware attack at the beginning of this year, and it actually cost them around $2 million. And it actually affected around a third of Americans through the leak of their data on the dark web. And how did this happen? Well, around 4 terabytes of data was stolen, and they were able to gain access to stolen credentials and use those credentials against a Citrix instance without MFA. So they pretty much walked straight through the back door. And this was basically as a result of an affiliate to the Black Cat group. But where things do get a little bit different, and the plot thickens a little bit here, is where the Black Cat group decided to shut down their operation, and they basically stole all of the payment for themselves. And so the affiliate basically rebelled against. They decided to post all of the data on the dark web, and it was later taken down. So the implication is there that Change Healthcare bought the data, and they effectively paid 2 lots of ransoms as a result of this incident. Okay, so on to medical devices. So we know that medical devices have been used in healthcare for many, many years. If we think about X-rays were first used all the way back in 1895, so a long, 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 long time ago. If we think about medical data and how medical data is communicated, the first medical record systems were used in the 1960s. So again, a long time ago. Things are becoming more internet connected in recent years. So internet medical devices are predicted to rise to around 760 million by around 2026. So slightly scary thought, but it highlights the fact that we need to make sure that security is considered throughout the entire process. So right from manufacture, all the way through to configuration, and all the way through to use as well. There's a company called Clarity who've done a number of really cool pieces of research into the healthcare space, and I've actually taken a few stats from one of their recent blog posts on how events impact medical devices. Part of my role in the ASM world actually involves keeping quite a close eye to the ground, close ear to the ground rather, with regards to what vulnerabilities are being actively exploited in the wild. And one of the sources that I typically would use for this is CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. And what Clarity have actually done is put two and two together in this case. So they've looked at the various devices that they've used for their research and cross-compared them against what's on CISA's KEV list. And as a result, they've observed around 63% of vulnerabilities tracked on CISA's KEV can be found in hospital networks. And on the other hand, around 23% of medical devices have at least one known exploited vulnerability. Okay, so looking at this in a little bit more detail, this is basically what you might find within a hospital network, and each of these devices could be considered a potential access vector for an attacker. If we think about the data flow here, we might have a patient sat in a patient bed, hooked up to a patient monitor, and their heart rate reading might be getting stored in the data center. That patient might have had a number of tests in the lab, and those test results are also being stored within the data center. The pharmacy might need to prescribe some medication for this particular patient, and therefore they might need to query the data and the medical records from the data center to be able to prescribe the correct medication. But how exactly is this data communicated? So these are some of the common protocols that you might find within the healthcare industry, and the most commonly used is a protocol named Health Level 7. There are a number of newer protocols, but for the purpose of my research, I decided to focus on HL7, primarily for the fact that it is quite an old protocol. It is most commonly used, and a lot of devices in the healthcare space just aren't compatible with these newer protocols. But let's take a look at some of the others beforehand. So firstly, we've got FHIR, or Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, bit of a mouthful. But this is one of the newer protocols that was designed by the HL7 Standards Organization. It was also designed to be a simpler way of communicating medical data through the use of APIs. And therefore, it's easier to integrate within applications and other systems. Therefore, potentially more secure? You may think so, but in fact, Alyssa Knight actually found that they were able to gain access to around 4 million patient records as a result of misconfigured APIs. The data flow might look something like this. So you've got medical applications at the top. It would then query through the API, through the FHIR server, and then query the medical records through the medical record database at the end. So, putting my ASM hat on, as I promised, we can look at what the internet exposure looks like with regards to FHIR and other medical protocols. So this was basically just a simple showdown search using a content type header, which quite often will include the FHIR keyword. Only around 256 exposed to the internet, so relatively low number, but maybe 256 too many. Okay, so on to DICOM. So DICOM is used for transmitting medical images. And these images are actually stored in a DICOM format, so that will look something like .dcm. Going back to Clarity, they also put out some really cool research into DICOM, which actually focused on two path traversal vulnerabilities. And both of these vulnerabilities could basically be exploited to achieve remote code execution. They also focused on the fact that a lot of DICOM servers are exposed to the internet and are misconfigured. So again, ASM hat on, I went and had a look, and there are around 5,600 DICOM servers exposed to the internet. So that is pretty scary. Moving on to HL7. So as I mentioned, this is the focus of my research. HL7 was originally released in 1979, so it's a very old protocol. And typically, you'll see the most common version used in hospitals is version 2. Excuse me. Version 3 was released in an attempt to be more secure again, and you will probably not see this in use purely for the fact that it's not backwards compatible. So most devices will be using version 2, and therefore version 2 is the version that I decided to focus on for my research. Quite typically, HL7 messages will be communicated using the minimal lower layer protocol, but you can also communicate HL7 messages through protocols such as FTP, SMTP, but obviously you've got all of the security controls to consider with those protocols as well. But the main thing to mention here is that HL7 messages are communicated in clear text. OK, so what does the HL7 message look like? So it will look a little bit like this. Each message is made up of a number of segments, which will be the first 3 characters that you can see here. Each segment will contain a number of fields, and each field will be separated by a pipe character. Each message will start with message header, that you can see there, and it will also contain a message type. So this message type is the admissions, discharges, and transfers in this case. You'll often see the event segment, so that will basically tell the server where the message starts, where and when the message was sent from. You'll typically see the patient identifier, which contains patient information. You might find next of kin, so that's quite self-explanatory. And also here in this example, we've got allergen information for this particular patient. Not all segments are required, but specific fields are required for specific segments. So if those fields aren't included and the segment is sent, the HL7 message won't be accepted by the server. OK, so as I mentioned, minimal lower layer protocol, or MLLP, is one of the most common ways to transport HL7 messages via TCP/IP. Messages are typically wrapped, so they'll contain a start block, an end block, and a carriage return. And this is basically to notify the server where the message will start and where the message ends. And that's basically so that messages don't get mixed up, and you can basically see, what medical record belongs to what patient. OK, let's talk about some of the common vulnerabilities in HL7. There's been some really great research into this, and I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but if you did want to check it out, I've included a couple of links there, and I'll also include these links in my resource slides as well. Firstly, HL7 doesn't require any kind of authentication to be able to send a message. So in theory, John Doe could basically send any message he wants to any device or server, and the server would just assume that it was being received by who it was supposed to be received. There is, in fact, a user authentication credential segment that you can implement in HL7 messages, and that basically allows you to implement Kerberos or SAML authentication. But of course, this is not enabled by default, and so you typically won't find this enabled on a lot of messages. John Doe can also attempt to amend messages if he's positioned in a way that he can do so on the network, and therefore, if he's able to intercept, he can potentially change and alter the message contents. Quite often as well, on middleware applications and servers, you'll find that you can have a maximum number of connections. And so if we can exceed this number of connections, we can potentially cause a denial of service attack. That maximum number of connections is typically quite low. So on the middleware application that I decided to test, this was around 10 connections. So, relatively easy to be able to cause a DOS. But as I mentioned previously, HL7 messages are communicated in clear text. So that opens up a whole number of issues. For example, we're able to carry out a person in the middle attack and also carry out ARP spoofing to gain access to the data. OK, as I mentioned at the beginning, a little bit lighthearted, but factual, right? So I just wanted to take a moment to really think about the impacts in this case. So here are just a few examples with regards to the potential impacts around exploited HL7. But in an absolute worst-case scenario, we could cause a severe impact to individuals. If we're able to position ourselves on the network, which is not unachievable, given a lot of hospital networks are relatively flat, and if we're able to intercept the network, we can potentially amend messages. And that might look something like amending the record and amending allergen information, which could result in the prescription of incorrect drugs. And of course, this is only possible given the right conditions. So now you can see just how important it is that we make sure we test medical devices. But of course, this comes with its own challenges. HL7 is very difficult to fingerprint. So again, put my ASM hat on, it's not easy for me to be able to search Showdown and try and find HL7 instances. There's no default ports it runs on, and there's no sort of reliable fingerprinting methods through things like Nmap or other port scanning tools. We could, however, look at what default ports have been set by the device itself, and then potentially sort of listen for traffic on the network. But I would not recommend port scanning a medical device, as I found. The device that I was using, basically, if you port scan legacy medical devices, you'll basically just knock them over. So I do not recommend doing that. And please do not test medical devices in production. I know that sounds obvious to some people, but needs to be said. OK, again, I mentioned it a few times, but HL7 messages are communicated in clear text, unless TLS has been set on the device itself. So again, going back to the device that I was using, it did have a checkbox in the admin panel that allowed you to be able to set encryption, but again, not set by default. So typically, communications will be sent in clear text. If we can position ourselves on the network and intercept the traffic, we could potentially find a way to access the data or amend messages. This isn't typically that easy, given the fact that a lot of messages are wrapped with that MLLP wrapper, and HL7 is fairly non-standard in terms of the protocol itself. So a lot of tooling and a lot of security tools just won't be able to deal with that particular protocol. We could sit ourselves on the network and observe the traffic through something like Wireshark, and that might look like this. But in fact, let's see this in action. So this is the medical device that I was using, and it's called the Philips Sure Signs Patient Monitor. And as you can see, I'm hooked up, and in a matter of seconds, we should start seeing my blood oxygen readings and my heart rate readings come through. We'll start to see these through Wireshark as well. I appreciate it's probably quite small. But after a while, we'll start to see the HL7 message come through in its own packet form. So this will contain all of the segments and all of the relevant fields for that particular message. OK, so another challenge that comes with testing HL7 messages is that HL7 messages are really easy to read. They're not easy to read at all. And can you imagine if you're testing multiple devices and multiple messages like this come through at once? It's just not going to be easy for you to test and not efficient in the slightest. So how can we overcome these challenges? There's been a few different tools that have been released for the purpose of testing HL7. There was a tool named Pestilence, which was actually developed by a few guys who are quite involved with the biohacking village at DEF CON. They actually decided not to release the tool, and I think probably due to moral grounds. I think the tool was basically designed to send quite a lot of malicious payloads, and if it fell into the wrong hands, you've got that whole issue to deal with. Another tool called MedAudit was developed by a guy called Anirudh Dagal, and that basically allows you to fuzz messages and send HL7 messages to devices. But there were still a number of requirements on my own checklist that were missing from these tools when I tried them. So what do we need? So again, this is kind of all personal preference, but me being a lazy hacker, I decided that I just wanted something to be able to work with Burp Suite. I just wanted to test HL7 just like you would with HTTP or a web application. And so I decided to create a Burp Suite plugin designed to pass HL7 messages. This basically used the HL7 APY Python library, and it was designed to make the testing of medical devices using HL7 messages a lot simpler. So how does this work? So at the bottom, we've got the original communication. So a HL7 message is sent from a medical device and accepted by the server. And then in the middle is where we've got the magic. I decided to use man-in-the-middle relay, and that basically allows you to be able to proxy non-HTTP traffic through Burp. So that sat in between my client and my server, and it allowed the traffic to be able to flow through to Burp. Once the message hit Burp, we could then dynamically pass the contents. And this basically meant that we were able to pass any version of HL7 and any segment contents as well. The message was then converted into JSON, so that basically allows us to be able to read it easy. And our theoretical attacker could then potentially amend the message. Message is then converted back into JSON and sent onto the server. So let's have a look at how this works. I'm going to be taking you through two demos. The first demo will basically be using a client emulator. So this will basically act like our medical device, and it will basically just be sending a HL7 message through to the server. The second demo will be using the medical device itself. So it will be using the Philips Sure Signs patient monitor that I mentioned on the previous slide. Quick disclaimer, this is available on GitHub now, so if you do decide to use it, please do not use it on production devices. Needs to be said, just in case. OK, so the first example, as I mentioned, this is using our client emulator. So here we've got the HL7 message that was featured on the previous slide. We'll go ahead and set up our man-in-the-middle relay command. It's listening on all IPs. We've got the client sending data on port 8880, and our server is listening on localhost port 8888. We've also got Burp configured to listen on localhost on port 8081. Just to confuse you, as you can see. And so we can go ahead and intercept, set our server to listen, go ahead and configure our man-in-the-middle relay command, so that's now passing data through, and we can send our HL7 message from the client. As you can see, it then hits Burp, but not easy to read, difficult to work with. We can go into HL7Magic, and as you can see, the contents have now been dynamically passed, and we can see all of the segments and all of the fields within that segment as well, plus a little bit of extra data that we're able to pass out through this particular library. If we wanted to change some of the contents, we could do so. So for the purpose of this demo, we could decide to change the patient name from Mickey Mouse to Bob Mouse. We can go back, and this has now been transformed back into our HL7 format. We can forward this on, and it will now be accepted by the server with the new contents. OK, demo 2. So remember, this is now using the medical device that you saw in the previous slide. And think to me in the background, hooked up to the patient monitor, and we need to wait for the HL7 message to be sent through. So we're using a slightly different IP address this time, so we've got the 192.168.0.10. Man-in-the-middle relay command, fairly similar, but our client is now sending data on port 4000. Server set to listen on that 192.168 IP, and again, listening on port 8888. Burp, also listening on the same IP, and also listening on the same port as before, 8081. Click intercept, and we're ready to go. So our server is now listening. Man-in-the-middle relay, ready to forward the traffic through. And now we wait for the message. So here we've got the HL7 message from Sure Signs. Again, contents passed into nice JSON format. And so, again, for the purpose of this demo, we might decide to change some of the contents. And so, again, similarly as before, we might decide to change the patient name from Donald Trump to Donald Duck, topical. But if we really wanted to prove the impact, you might decide to change some of the readings in the message. So we could change the blood oxygen readings, or you might want to tamper with the heart rate readings here as well. As you can see, back into HL7 format, forwarded onto the server, and the server accepts our new message. OK, so just to wrap up on the HL7 side of things. HL7 is the most commonly used protocol in the healthcare industry, and it's vulnerable to a number of weaknesses if not securely configured. We know that it's difficult to test from a security perspective, it's difficult to fingerprint, messages are hard to read, and there's no current security tooling that allows us to be able to proxy traffic. I decided to create HL7Magic to make testing of medical devices using HL7 a lot simpler. And so if we decide to take a look at the bigger picture for just a second, remember at the beginning I said, see this as a call to arms. What can we do as an industry to help protect the healthcare industry? We know that ransomware is considered one of the most top threats to the healthcare industry, but on the other hand, threats to medical devices can be more severe in terms of their impact. We also know that a significant number of medical devices and protocols are exposed to the internet. And so, as an industry, we really need to be carrying out more research in this area, spreading the word, and helping those folk in the healthcare industry be more clued up in the security world. But if you had to ask me what are my 3 top tips that I could give people in healthcare, first one being, know your attack surface. I don't know how I've made this into an ASM talk, but I've done it. But it's really important. It's really important to know what you've got out there, what's exposed to the internet, what your devices are doing, where they're communicating, are they communicating HL7 messages in clear text, and therefore that will give you a good understanding of what your risk looks like. Number 2, segregate your network. Do not put your medical devices on the same network as your guests. Enough said. Number 3, implement a robust patch management process. As Clarity said, a high number of medical devices have at least one known exploited vulnerability. So making sure things are being patched and they're up to date can really help in this sense. And that's been me, folks. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for coming.